Hello again. This is Melissa Reed's Avatar, Book 1 by S.D. Perry. And we're still in Chapter 3, so let's get right back into it. With the USS Aldebaran working its sixth day of sentinel detail for the space station, the bridge wasn't overly crowded or overly busy. The helm and science officers weren't present, and communications was represented by a second-year cadet, one of several trainees currently earning hours on the Aldebaran. Captain Robeson was in his ready room, probably catching up on paperwork, and although Tis Jana occupied the captain's chair, she looked as distant-eyed as everyone else on duty, excepting the cadet, of course, who stared intently at his console, waiting for any incoming calls. Trainees. It was hard sometimes not to pat their heads, they were so adorably vigilant. Thomas Chang, the Aldebaran's counselor for just over 7 years, wasn't officially on duty, but he spent a lot of his off hours on the bridge. He enjoyed the atmosphere of efficiency, liked watching the people he'd come to know so well as they applied their talents. Of course, watching them during downtime could often be just as interesting, but then finding people interesting was how he'd come to be a ship's counselor. Pretending to be absorbed in the contents of a science digest, Chang surreptitiously watched the men and women around him, occasionally tapping at the pad in order to deflect suspicion. He didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable, and besides, it was part of the game, trying to figure out what someone might be thinking about just by watching them, their gestures and body language. Shannon liked to joke that it was the Romulan in him, driving him to spy on the unwary. Because he was falling in love with her, Chang always laughed, but he couldn't help feeling a vague sadness when the topic came up, recalling the story of his great-grandmother's capture, and how that story had haunted him as a child. That the Romulans eventually released her, and that her life had been happy and full ever after, it couldn't take away the memory of hearing the awful truth for the first time. That a brutal man had once hurt her, and that man's blood ran in his own veins. Goodness. It seemed that he wasn't above a little daydreaming himself. Chang let the unhappy feelings go, letting his attention wander back to the pleasantly directionless analysis of his friends and co-workers. Tis Jana, for example, from the softly calculating gleam in her eye, the way she kept pulling on a lock of her curly dark hair, Chang imagined that she was thinking about those green opal and quillion earrings that the Ferengi bartender had shown her the first night they'd arrived at DS9. She wanted them, but wasn't willing to pay the obnoxiously high price that the bartender had quoted. Even now she was thinking of a counteroffer, and perhaps imagining what Lieutenant Commander Hopkingbird would say about them on their next date. Chang shifted in his chair, casting a sidelong glance at the officer in question. Mike Hopkingbird, Chief Tactical Officer and Tiss's recent love interest. Only a few people knew, of course. Chang had heard it from Mike himself and had been pleased. Mike and Tiss were a good match, and although they probably wouldn't let their romance be widely known, Mike was going to give it away if he didn't stop gazing at her with such obvious and ardent affection. It wasn't much of a jump for Chang to guess what Mike was thinking about, particularly considering his own developing relationship with Shannon. There was a definite rise in the number of romantic relationships on board, and, Chang imagined, all across the Alpha Quadrant. There were innumerable statistics and psychological studies he could cite to prove his point, but principally, as Captain Robeson himself had said, it's an end-of-the-war thing. Not that everyone was after romance. Kelly Eidemann, the dynamic young woman currently slouched comfortably at the engineering station, had already been to DS9 3 times to play Dabo and had done fairly well, although Chang couldn't rule out a romance there either. Some of the Dabo girls at Quarks were extremely attractive. As practical as the junior grade lieutenant was, however, he imagined that the slight smile she wore was for the clacking spin of the wheel and the delighted cries of the watching crowd over each Dabo win. He didn't much care for Dabo himself, but Shannon had been pushing for them to try out one of DS9's holosuite programs. It's Sam. One of DS9's holosuite programs, one recommended to her by Dr. Bashir. It was for some sort of combined gambling restaurant entertainment center set on Earth in the mid-20th century, and there was a game called Baccarat that Shannon very much wanted to try. Obviously, that's Vix. Shannon, a researcher on the Aldebaran's medical staff, had been corresponding with Bashir on and off for several years, debating something or other about chromatone formation, and had been excited to meet him. The doctor had turned out to be a very personable young man, and was apparently involved with the station's counselor, one Esri Dax. Dax was Trill, a species that Chang found to be highly perceptive as a general rule, and although he hadn't met her yet, he was interested in hearing her take on Van Leden's newest theories about focus charting. You're just pretending to read, aren't you? At the sound of Tiss's voice, Chang looked up guiltily. Tiss was smiling playfully. What an odd question, he said. What else could I possibly be doing? He tried, but couldn't keep a smile from creeping up as he spoke. As well as he'd come to know so many of the crew, they had come to know him. The thought was warm, inspiring a sense of belonging, and although he'd been caught out at his guessing game, he didn't mind a bit. Tiss started to answer. Then Lieutenant Eidemann was standing and turning, running to the helm, even as Mike Hoppingbird's usually calm voice was rising to a near shout. Commander, the wormhole, it's opening. Then Tiss was moving, calling for on-screen, calling for bridge personnel as Captain Robeson strode from his ready room, head up and eyes bright as he moved to his chair. Chang felt an instant of cold shock, watching numbly as the brilliant colors spread out in front of them. The wormhole hadn't opened since the last of the Dominion forces had returned to the Gamma Quadrant 3 months ago. And although the Aldebaran had been assigned to guard DS9 against any possibility of attack during their repairs, no one on the ship had really expected anything to happen. Thomas Chang swallowed his disbelief, hoping desperately that nothing would happen, refusing the idea that they might be in trouble. And even as he accepted that he was in denial, the first of the ships came through. So we've established all the status quo, met new characters, met old characters, and now action is starting. They were just finishing up their informal meeting when both of their comm badges trilled at once. Outside Kira's office window, men and women were jumping to their feet, dropping tools, and running to their half-assembled stations. On Kira's desk, an incoming call blinked urgently. The Aldebaran was hailing. Kira and Jas both stood, turning to look out at Ops. Shar's voice spilled into the room, the young officer speaking quickly as he looked in at them from his position on the main floor. Colonel, Commander, 3 Jem'Hadar strike ships have just come through the wormhole in attack formation, weapons and shields up, and they're heading for the Aldebaran. No. It was the unthinkable, the reason she put off upgrades for so long. Now, after 3 months of dead silence from the Dominion, it seemed that someone had decided to make contact, just when the station's defenses were at a minimum. Red alert, battle stations, she ordered. Shar, send out a distress call. Lock off non-essential systems, and get me everything on our weapons. I need to know where we are exactly. Implement emergency shelter protocols. Try to get us visuals on the main screen, and tell Nog to get the Defiant ready, now. She nodded at Jast, who took her cue and hurried out of the office and across Ops towards its transporter stage. Kira reached for the blinking light of the Aldebaran's call, already calculating the kind of damage they could expect if the ship couldn't stop the fighters. Her mind flooded with 2 recent images of burning starships and a growing dread. No tractor beams, limited shields, all of the new tactical systems that aren't even assembled yet. Kira felt sick and put it aside, praying things weren't as bad as she feared, suspecting that they were worse. That ends Chapter 3 on a cliffhanger. Oh, goodness. Scimitar coming through the wormhole. All those references to the station being just barely up and running while upgrades were being done. It was pretty well foreshadowed that something was going to happen. And it's especially interesting to meet all the new people on the Aldebaran. The guard ship for DS9 and the Defiant is being retrofitted too, so it's not in optimal shape. So this is bad news. Oh my goodness. So, well, have to pick it up in chapter 4. Looks like there's going to be a battle. I mentioned before how there was a lot of setup, a lot of introducing and reintroducing characters before the action started. Well, I suppose you could count the murder mystery part as action, but really a lot of it was introduction. It sounds boring, but that's important. You have to know what the status quo is before you threaten it, or else it doesn't really matter. And you need to introduce all these characters so we know what when they spring into action. We know who they are. We recognize their names anyway. So I think S.D. Perry did that very skillfully, and I admire the writing as well as the story. And we will end dogs on the floor. And we'll pick this up probably later today. I have things to do. Hopefully. But I'm glad to have chapter 3 done. I'm a completist in a way. So I'll post these videos and hope you enjoy them. Oh, I have a subscriber. Someone I know from Twitter, a fellow Trek fan. Hello, Justin. Thank you for subscribing. I appreciate it. And also, as always, Trek Book Club. Check out Trek fans on Twitter. I found them so far to be wonderful and a lot of fun to talk to. So, please check that out. And goodbye.